Before going further into this video, I do want to say that my history and heritage videos are not intended to spike any kind of hatred towards another. My videos are for educational purposes.
Okay, we are at the Stagville Plantation. We're going to do a tour today. This location, we are allowed to take videos and photos. However, this is one of North Carolina's largest plantation that had over, at one point in time, this particular plantation had over 900 slaves. So let's go take a tour.
VanLife gives me the freedom to explore my curiosity, and lately my curiosity is directing me to visit historical ancestral sites. These sites are places I've read or heard about, and some are places that I never knew existed. Many of us were conditioned to not bring up the past because it was too painful and it would make others feel uncomfortable. I believe history helps us realize how different our lived experience is from that of our ancestors. From learning from the aspects of cultural and identity transformations, we discover how our lives fit into the human experience. We all live in the present, and we all plan for the future. But how do we understand where we're going and what progress looks like? To know where you're going, you first need to understand where you come from. Visiting ancestral sites is a part of my history, which I embrace completely. As a spiritual person, I feel the pain of the past. I feel their strength, their courage, and their will to live. I also feel their laughter, and I admire their craftsmanship and creative gifts. Being in the presence of their past is an overwhelming feeling, but it teaches me to humble myself respectfully and to honor those before me. I believe before being colonized into religion, we were spiritual people who knew spiritual things, and we understood the unseen, but we have lost our way.
So again, welcome to Historic Stagville. Our site is a state historic site today, but we preserve a very small section of what once used to be one of the largest sites of slavery in all of North Carolina, probably among the largest sites of plantation slavery anywhere in the United States. By the 1850s and 1860s, the land that you're standing on right here was part of a massive plantation complex. By 1860, this property included about 50 square miles of land around us. So again, what you'll visit today is just a very small corner of that. And by 1865, just a few months before emancipation, we've documented a little over 1,000 men, women, and children who were held in bondage, captive in slavery on this site. That of course means that hundreds of other people experienced slavery here over the earlier generations of this place's history. Throughout its history as a plantation, this property was controlled by two powerful and wealthy white families, the Binahan and Cameron families. The Binahan and Cameron families married together. They formed a joint business partnership through that marriage to invest in slavery here, and they profited massively from the forced labor of enslaved Africans and African Americans who they held captive on this site. They used violence and fear and humiliation to maintain control over enslaved people on this property, and by the time of the American Civil War, some of the men and women in the Binahan and Cameron families were among the wealthiest people in the state of North Carolina. Today we'll see a few surviving buildings that connect to the history of slavery on this property. And today our site is dedicated to being a public history site, a place for folks like you to come and visit and learn. And our site is entirely focused on documenting and researching and teaching about the history of slavery on this property through oral histories, through surviving documents from records that survive from this plantation, and from archaeology evidence from this site, and from family stories that have been passed on through the generations and shared with us by people who still live here in North Carolina who've traced their roots back to ancestors who were enslaved here. So these stones in front of us here are the base of one of the many working buildings that once stood in this yard. This White House would not have been alone here on this hilltop. It would have been surrounded by not a open grass lawn, but by a busy, noisy, dusty, smoky, tense working yard around this house. There might have been 10 or 12 buildings that stood here in this working compound. And those included the kitchen building. This is the base of the huge fireplace and hearths and chimney that were here, with a wooden kitchen building beside it. But there would have been all sorts of other working buildings here in this yard. And of course, these were spaces that were most often used by enslaved families who were assigned to live and work in this yard. We'll see in a moment also the ruins of one of the cabins where one of these families lived here. This kitchen actually might have also been part of the quarters here in this yard, because it probably had a small attic loft over the main working room in the kitchen. And an enslaved cook who was assigned to prepare meals in this building might have also been expected to live and sleep in that cramped space over the kitchen room. This kitchen is a wonderful place for us to think a little bit more about the experiences of enslaved families who did domestic work here. Over time, there were many white households connected to this plantation where the families who controlled this plantation lived. And so there were at times dozens of enslaved people doing domestic work in these spaces between these different properties. And we see several patterns throughout the records that give us a sense of the daily lives and experiences of people who did domestic work. We see very clearly that these households, these yards and kitchens and houses, were just as dangerous a place for someone to be enslaved as any field or workshop here. The violence within these households was a perfectly ordinary part of slavery. We see this show up in these painfully casual ways in some of the surviving letters from the Bina and Cameron families. For example, on one occasion, one of the men in the Cameron family, Duncan Cameron, the patriarch of the family, was sick for a period of about 18 months, and his family were, of course, overjoyed when he recovered from his illness. And his daughter wrote a letter to the other members of her family celebrating her father's return to health and describing how he was full of energy yet again and picking up all of his usual business around the property, and that she was just trying to keep up with him and convince him to rest and take care of himself. And very casually in the letter at one point she says that she knows that her father has returned to being himself again because he has beaten more people in the last few days than he has over the last 18 months. Then, of course, we think about the life of the enslaved man who was expected to be Duncan Cameron's body servant, to wake him in the morning, to shave him, to dress him, to stand by his side at every hour of the day. And we can imagine the great danger that that person was navigating in this household. Named Jack here. Although Jack was not someone who worked directly in the Bina family's household, he was able to learn, probably through this word of mouth passed out of their household, that the Bina family had made plans to sell him. And worse than that, they had in fact been trying to sell him for some period of time and hadn't found a local purchaser. Jack realized what this meant, which is that it might mean that he was more likely to be sent to a distant auction or sent somewhere out of North Carolina and perhaps be sold hundreds of miles away from whatever family or community he had here. And so he was able to use this information to take action. It would have been very risky, but he took the risk of leaving the boundaries of this plantation, which of course would have been forbidden, and he went up the road to a neighboring white farmer. He waited until that man came out of his house, and then he begged and pleaded with him to purchase him. As twisted as it seems for Jack to have to ask another human being to buy him as a piece of property, Jack knew that if he could be sold to a neighboring farm, it was more likely that he could sneak away a few times a year and maybe still see whoever it was he loved who was here. Maybe he would still be able to pass messages back and forth and maintain some of that relationship. And we only know of this story because in this case, Jack was successful, and that neighbor did submit an offer to the Bina family to purchase him. And as far as I can tell, at least at first, that is where Jack was sold to. So Jack's story gives us a really clear example of how the risks that people took in the face of family separation here, and also the way that even someone like Jack, who was living in the confines of slavery here, could find ways to find moments of agency, especially when it came to protecting family.
I'm assuming he was probably beaten for that, though, for leaving the property.
We can't tell from the surviving records, but of course that was the risk that he was accepting, and we certainly see other examples throughout the history of this place of people who were whipped or beaten brutally for leaving the property, or even simply leaving the house or the site within the plantation where they were assigned to live sometimes. The foundation site that we're looking at here, this kind of rectangle of stones, is the base of a small cabin that stood in this yard. We're probably on the very outside edge of the working yard around this white house. And this house was a one-room log cabin building. The log walls might have looked a little similar to the kind of log construction you can see in that tobacco barn that's next door. Similar style of walls. And this would have been a building where one family lived. That could have meant that 3 or 4 people were sharing this room. It could have meant that 10 or 11 or 12 people were living in this house, depending on the size of the family and how many people in that family were together, how many generations were living here. The family who lived in this particular house would have been probably assigned to work somewhere right here in this house or yard. And there would have been several cabins like this scattered near where we're standing. This is one of our most special archaeology sites here on the property because there was a small seashell that was excavated here underneath this house. You can see a big zoomed in picture of it there on that sign. It's actually about that big in real life. I usually have one with me, but I forgot it today. And this shell is a variety of cowrie shell. You might be familiar with cowries. The variety that was found here is probably a kind of shell that is not native to the Atlantic Ocean. So this is not a shell that's just going to wash up on a beach in North Carolina all on its own. These shells were often collected on the beaches of the Indian Ocean, on the coast of East Africa. There was a very active cowrie trade across the continent into Western and Central Africa, and they were considered precious and valuable in many different cultures in Western Africa. So we can't connect this shell to one specific West African tradition or one specific place in West Africa, but it does allow us to imagine how there may have been a family here in slavery who still had with them something that they recognized as a marker of West African identity and culture. This may have, of course, even been something that their ancestors had carried or worn through the Middle Passage, through that horrific journey into slavery in North America. And in some places in West Africa, cowries were sacred objects used as part of religious ceremonies and faith traditions. In some places they were markers of leadership, of status, of royalty, of authority. In some places they were used for decoration or for currency or for trade. Regardless, this shell gives us a very tangible reminder of the way that enslaved people here and all across this country found ways to hold on to a sense of their roots, a sense of West African identity and tradition, even through maybe generations of slavery. The family who lived in this house might have been the 4th or 5th generation of their family to be enslaved in North America. We don't know. But they might have still had faith traditions or language traditions or food traditions to go along with this shell that they were passing on in this house. And we talk a lot about people resisting slavery through escaping to freedom or through armed resistance, but there were all sorts of ways that enslaved people resisted slavery in addition to that. And this kind of keeping of tradition and holding on to that sense of identity was a kind of cultural resistance, right? It was an act of resistance against the institution of slavery, which was designed to separate people from that very heritage and from those very family roots.
A lot to take in, y'all. I'm handling it very well. Yeah, a lot to take in. This plantation was something else. Whew. I couldn't imagine what my ancestors went through living here. The plantation is so huge. We actually have to drive to to the next spot.
This row of houses that we're standing in front of right now, these are original slave dwellings which were constructed here in the 1850s. This is actually the only surviving set of slave dwellings from any part of the Bina or Cameron plantations. So of course there would have been many places across those thousands of acres of land where there were scattered houses and cabins where enslaved families lived. But we only have one set of those buildings that have survived, and that is this particular row. These buildings probably don't represent the typical houses where enslaved families lived on this land. According to oral histories and surviving archaeological evidence, a lot of the other sites of slave dwellings here were small log or rough, small one-room cabin houses, like the foundation site that this part of our tour visited earlier. These buildings are this very large sort of two-story design. And these buildings would have been unusually large and unusually sturdy in their construction compared to probably many of the other houses that were once here. But these buildings are somewhat deceptive because often when we first look at these houses, they seem like quite a large building. These are actually multi-family houses, so there would have been many people who were forced to share each one of these houses. These buildings are divided into 4 rooms. So there's 2 rooms downstairs, there's 2 rooms upstairs, and there likely would have been an entire family living in each of those rooms. So it's very easy to imagine anywhere from 20 to 30 people living in this house here. And by 1857, we know that there were probably about 110 or 115 people living here on this row between the 4 houses that are here.
Wow.
These buildings in the 1850s would have been surrounded by working fields. You might have noticed when we were driving that you could kind of see that we came down that big slope. So we came down from the ridge where that White House was earlier. We came down into what were sometimes called the bottomlands or the lowlands here. This is the more low-lying land that ran along the rivers and streams through this plantation. We're here in the kind of bottomlands along the Flat River, which is about 3/4 of a mile that way. That's one of the 3 rivers that ran through this plantation. And a lot of the land in front of these houses, beginning probably just about right where those utility poles are, would have been the start of a working crop field here. And those fields probably ran all the way down to the river and continued across the valley on the other side of the banks as well. The families who lived in these houses were probably mostly assigned to do farming labor here. Any person over the age of 11 was probably expected to work from dawn to dusk every day of the week except Sunday on those surrounding farms here. The families that lived on this row in the 1850s would have been living through probably some of the most tumultuous and disruptive years in the history of slavery here. By this point in the 1850s, this plantation was firmly under the control of 2 of Richard Binahan's grandchildren, his grandson Paul Cameron and Paul's sister Margaret Cameron. And Paul and Margaret, as brother and sister, jointly controlled this plantation between them through the years leading up to the American Civil War. They made a series of decisions that resulted in a great deal of family separation and disruption for many enslaved families here at Stagville. By this point in the 1850s, there were probably close to 800 people living in slavery across this plantation. Paul Cameron wanted to invest in the booming cotton economy of the Deep South, which of course was driving the expansion of slavery into the Deep South and further west. And so he ultimately decided to purchase an additional tract of plantation land in Alabama. In the late 1840s, he picked out about 114 enslaved people who were enslaved here in North Carolina on this property, and he forced them to march to Alabama to construct a new cotton plantation for him there in the Deep South. Every few years after that first march, Paul would pick out additional families, additional people, and force them to go south to that cotton land. So families here at Horton Grove and this row of buildings were living every winter with the uncertainty of Would they be next? Would someone they love be the next in the next group of families who would be forced to go south? Paul and Margaret Cameron both invested in the railroads in North Carolina during this time period. This was when really the first boom of railroad construction was happening, right, in the 1850s. And Paul and Margaret both became investors in the first really major east-west railroad in North Carolina, the North Carolina Railroad, a project largely sponsored and directed by the state government here in North Carolina. And they were able to obtain lucrative contracts for the construction of part of that railroad in this part of the state, which of course meant in reality that enslaved people from this site were preparing and laying the railroad beds for that railroad construction. By the mid-1850s, as many as 90 people at a time might have been uprooted from this plantation and forced to go into other parts of what was then Orange County to live in temporary work camps in harsh living conditions, putting together the start of what would be this railroad line. Even after the railroad construction was finished, Paul and Margaret continued renting people from this plantation to the railroad companies to maintain those railroads. These were almost always young men, sometimes teenagers, sometimes boys as young as 15 or 16 or 17 years old, and they were rented out to the railroad companies for a duration of usually 11 or 12 months, which means they had to leave their family, their parents, their brothers and sisters who might have been here, and were forbidden to return to this plantation until the following Christmas, usually, when their contracts binding them to the railroad companies would finally expire. Margaret Cameron and also married a man from another wealthy plantation holding family in this part of the state. She married George Washington Mordecai. The Mordecai plantation is in Raleigh, east of us. And after this marriage, George and Margaret decided to carry out what is probably, at least to our knowledge, the only kind of single massive sale of enslaved people that happened on this property. There, of course, were many times where people were bought or sold here. It was often single families or individuals, but in the fall of 1859, George and Margaret ordered the sale of what would be ultimately 107 people who were sold in a week from the southern parts of this plantation. As of yet, I have yet to find any document that tells us exactly why that sale took place, but George and Margaret made the equivalent of somewhere over what would be about $3 million today that week from those sales. And remarkably, we actually have a surviving narrative from Morgan Latta, a young boy who grew up in slavery on that section of the plantation. His immediate family members were not sold that day, but he wrote in his narrative about his memories of slavery here, and some of his strongest and most emotional memories are of witnessing what other families experienced in those sales. He wrote his narrative about 50 years after emancipation, after his childhood in slavery here, but it's clear from his writing that the memories of the horror of that day stayed with him for the rest of his life. And he remembers as a child that watching people being sold and separated from their family members, he felt that it was almost like a moment of death that he was being forced to witness. He said that when someone was told that they would be sent away from their husband or their wife or their children, he said they would fall down onto the ground as if they had been shot and lie motionless with grief in the dirt. He also remembered the elders in his community, his grandmother and grandfather, other elders. He remembered that while the place where they were living was full of the screams of families being torn apart and overseers yelling at people and taking people from their families, he remembers in the midst of all this noise and all this fear, he remembers his grandparents and other elders in the community getting down on their knees in the dirt and beginning to quietly pray together. And he says that while this was happening around them, they prayed that God would abolish slavery forever, everywhere in the United States, and that not only that they would be free, but that no one would ever have to experience something like this again. Morgan was about 7 years old when slavery ended here, and 7 or 8 years old, and he remembered one of his clear memories of the day that he learned that he and his family would finally be free were some of these same adults in his community turning to each other and saying, finally, I've been praying for 30 or 40 years, and finally God has brought about the end of slavery in this nation. The families that lived here on this row of houses were living through that era that I just described, right? This unprecedented sale, the hiring out of people, the railroad contracts, the marches of people, the movement of people into the Deep South. And so families here might have had powerful family and community around them that they had built to survive here in this place, but they were living with the constant uncertainty and anxiety of when their family might be affected by these changes. There were almost certainly enslaved people who were making these bricks in the summer of 1850, handling the clay while it was still a little damp. If you want to come up close and see some of them, there's a pretty clear thumbprint right here. There's a few finger marks on the edge of that brick, and then this one's quite clear where you can see kind of the four fingers of someone's hand lifting and moving that brick.
Whenever you're down, out in the cold, faithless and dark, your story's untold. Come take my hand and walk there with me. I know a place where we can be free. There is a light shining for you, guiding your way.
You're welcome. Like all of our buildings, it's had some repair work and preservation done on it, but we've never like rebuilt the whole portion of it or completely redone part of the building. We have not. So this building it's very similar to the houses we were in earlier. Most of the large beams, the foundations, the framing of the building is original. This building is built in the 1860s, so that's how old many of these timbers are. And the siding on the outside of the building or the roof has probably been replaced many times over the years. Some of that was done long before this was a historic site. This is what we call the Great Barn. It obviously is a just massive barn that was built here in 1860. And this would have actually been built as a working stables. There probably would have been mules and horses living in this building. It would have been surrounded by those open fields, so it would have been probably pretty visible up over the working fields here. And then there were these huge lofts upstairs and on either side of the building for storing hay and feed and other farming equipment and supplies here. Families who lived in those houses where we were earlier might well have walked here in the morning and packed up teams of animals and gathered tools and headed out into the surrounding farms to work. But what we think is most extraordinary about this building is just like the house where we were before, we think that this building was probably built entirely by enslaved builders and craftsmen here. It's really rare to see this kind of massive barn in this part of the country, at least from this time period. And so it gives us a really clear example of how builders and carpenters who were enslaved might have been doing work that really was kind of incredibly skilled and incredibly expert. I think it's a very powerful reminder of how slavery profited not just from the physical work that enslaved people did, but also from the skills and knowledge and expertise of enslaved people and the work of enslaved people's minds as well as their hands.
Did they educate the people here?
So almost everyone who was in slavery here would have been forbidden from having access to any kind of education. It was uncommon for a lot of the history of slavery, and then around 1830, North Carolina passed a law that made it illegal in North Carolina to teach an enslaved person to read or write, and that was in response to fears of uprisings of enslaved people who might use literacy to organize and message with each other, and also a response to a black man named David Walker, who was from North Carolina, who was publishing abolitionist materials and publishing work about the evils of slavery, and so clearly showing how literacy could be used as a tool to fight the institution of slavery. And after that point, it, of course, was even rarer. But there are several instances of enslaved people who were educated here, typically people who were assigned to do domestic work or record-keeping work, where they were expected to write records as part of the labor that they were assigned to do. But most people here, it probably would have been very risky for them to learn to read and write. They might have done so secretly, but it would have had to be covert.
Whenever you're down, out in the cold, faithless and dark, your story's untold. Come take my hand and walk there with me. I know a place where we can be free. There is a light shining for you, guiding your way, helping you through. And shadows and gloom are all that you see. We'll find a place where we can be free. From the mountain top down to the deepest valley, hear a voice calling you. It's the rising sun shining in the darkest alley. Can't you see you will be free? I have been far, I have been wide, searching for peace, somewhere to hide.